Hey everybody, welcome back to the Diplomacy and Discourse channel, and thank you for joining us for episode 10, part 2 of our series on power politics. In our last episode, we explored the rise of imperial power, the weaponization of religion by medieval monarchs, and the ideological and industrial forces that drove the 20th century's major conflicts, from the world wars to the nuclear brinkmanship of the Cold War. Now in part 2, we turn to the post-Cold War era, a time marked by shifting paradigms and redefined power. We'll unpack the so-called unipolar moment of American dominance, the rise of soft power and international institutions, and the emergence of new political actors. From the liberal optimism of the 1990s to the resurgence of hard power and nationalist agendas in the 2010s and beyond, we'll examine how power politics didn't disappear, it adapted. This episode highlights key figures like Joe Biden, Donald Trump, Ursula von der Leyen, and Annalena Baerbock, whose decisions today echo centuries of strategic behavior, yet operate in a world shaped by global interdependence, digital warfare, and climate diplomacy. Power politics is still a key feature in global affairs, especially when looking at the behavior of countries like Russia and the United States. Both nations use it, but their styles have evolved in different directions. Russia has leaned heavily into hard power in the past decade. In 2014, the 2014 annexation of Crimea from Ukraine, which followed a contested referendum, is widely seen as a major violation of international law. In 2015, it intervened militarily in Syria to prop up Bashar al-Assad's regime, giving Moscow a stronger foothold in the Middle East. Since 2022, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine has further highlighted its use of direct military aggression. Beyond warfare, Russia uses other forms of coercion: sanctions, energy leverage, and cyber operations. Its alleged role in attempting to influence elections in the US, France, and other countries through disinformation campaigns and cyber intrusions shows how power politics has expanded into the digital sphere. The United States also engages in power politics, though in recent years it has emphasized diplomacy and economic leverage more than outright military action. That hasn't always been the case though. Its 2003 invasion of Iraq and Cold War-era interventions in Latin America like Nicaragua, Chile, and El Salvador were classic examples of using force or covert operations to protect American interests. More recently, the US has relied on sanctions as a primary tool, especially against Iran, North Korea, and Russia. The 2015 nuclear deal with Iran under President Obama showed a shift toward multilateral diplomacy, offering sanctions relief in exchange for limits on Iran's nuclear program. His administration also moved toward normalizing relations with Cuba and cautiously engaged North Korea through back-channel diplomacy. So what is back-channel diplomacy? Back-channel diplomacy is basically when governments or political leaders talk to each other in private, off the record, away from the cameras, and outside the usual official channels. It's not about sneaking around in a shady way, though. It's more about creating a quiet space where sensitive conversations can happen without all the noise and pressure that come with public negotiations. These kind of talks usually involve trusted intermediaries, advisors, or sometimes even direct contact between leaders who want to test the waters before making anything official. This kind of diplomacy really comes in handy when formal talks have stalled, or when going public with negotiations could make things worse. It gives both sides a chance to be more honest, float new ideas, and feel out compromises without being judged or boxed in by political expectations. That said, it's not without its downsides. Back-channel efforts can confuse the public, clash with official policy, or trigger backlash if people feel like decisions are being made behind closed doors. One of the most famous examples of this happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. While the world was holding its breath, President Kennedy and Soviet leader Khrushchev were quietly sending messages through a back channel, including one involving U.S. diplomat Averell Harriman. Those low-key conversations helped the two sides step back from the brink of nuclear war. Even today, back-channel diplomacy is very much alive. In 2023, after the whole Chinese spy balloon incident, U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan quietly met with China's top diplomat, Wang Li, in Vienna. Those private talks helped dial down tensions over Taiwan and other hot-button issues, eventually leading to a more public summit between President Biden and President Xi Jinping. It didn't solve everything, but it helped avoid escalation. And that's a win in today's world. In the end, back-channel diplomacy isn't just about cutting corners. It's about having a private lane for real conversations, especially when official ones are stuck or just too risky. It's not flashy, and you probably won't hear about it until much later. But in global politics, those quiet talks can sometimes be the ones that matter most. President Trump brought a more aggressive style of power politics back into the spotlight. He pulled the US out of the Iran deal in 2018, reinstated heavy sanctions on Tehran, launched a trade war with China by slapping tariffs, and supported Israel's claim over Jerusalem. He took a hardline stance with North Korea, combining threats with high-profile summits. His administration used sanctions wildly, targeting Venezuela, Cuba, and Russia, and pushed hardline immigration policies that had diplomatic fallout. Trump's foreign policy was grounded in unilateralism and economic nationalism, often bypassing multilateral institutions in favor of direct transactional gains. His approach embraced power politics openly, viewing diplomacy through the lens of competition and leverage. Back when President Biden took office, he pledged to undo many of Trump's shifts and restore traditional diplomacy. His administration rejoined the Paris Agreement, restarted talks with Iran, rolled back some Cuba sanctions, and sought to ease tensions with China. He emphasized multilateralism, coalition building, and a return to alliances, particularly with NATO. But despite the diplomatic tone, the US under Biden had continued to practice power politics, just in a more calibrated way. Support for Ukraine has included billions in military and economic aid, while relations with China remains tense over Taiwan and the South China Sea. Even though Biden's strategy places more emphasis on diplomacy, economic statecraft is still a form of power politics, just less confrontational. Sanctions, foreign aid leverage, and military posturing remains tools in Washington's playbook. What we see now is a blended model, diplomacy reinforced by coercive options, including sanctions and military partnerships, especially in strategic regions like Eastern Europe and the Indo-Pacific. Biden's approach may be more cooperative than Trump's, but it is still rooted in the logic of power politics, only expressed through the language of alliances and shared values. The foreign policy divide between Biden and Trump illustrates two fundamentally different worldviews. Biden's liberal realism sought to position the US as a stabilizing force through alliances and values-based leadership. Trump's America First doctrine rejected many of those principles in favor of deal-making, sovereignty, and a hard-edged approach to adversaries. Biden aimed to restore America's reputation as a partner. Trump redefined it as a power broker. These philosophies continue to shape US actions in regions like the Middle East, Asia, and Europe, where both strategy and style determine how American influence is projected, and how global power dynamics unfold. As of May 2025, President Donald Trump's second-term foreign policy agenda shows a continued reliance on power politics, heavily shaped by economic leverage, selective diplomacy, and strategic disengagement from multilateral commitments. In the Middle East, he's made some headlining-grabbing moves, lifting U.S. sanctions on Syria after the rise of President Ahmed al-Sharaa signals a dramatic shift in policy. It's less about endorsing Assad's departure and more about Trump's willingness to pivot quickly if it opens the door to American economic opportunity and regional influence. His administration argues this will support Syrian reconstruction and curb Iranian sway, though critics say it legitimizes a regime with a long record of human rights abuses. The Qatar visit fits right into Trump's transactional model. $200 billion for Boeing jets, and another $38 billion in potential military investments. These deals aren't just about boosting U.S. defense industries. They reinforce security ties with Gulf states while drawing Qatar closer into Washington's sphere, balancing both Iranian and Turkish influence in the region. Trump's overture to Iran about negotiating a new nuclear deal on the condition that Tehran ditches its proxies and halts nuclear ambitions reflects a strategic shift. Rather than maximum pressure through isolation, he's signaling interests in cutting a deal if the terms favor U.S. interests and regional allies. It's vintage Trump all over again. Apply pressure, then offer a seat at the table. In Ukraine, he's moved towards diplomacy, dispatching Secretary of State Marco Rubio to Turkey for talks. Trump has long questioned U.S. spending and European commitment in Ukraine, and now he's framing diplomacy as a way to reduce American entanglement while nudging the EU and Turkey to take more ownership of the conflict resolution process. His executive order pausing all foreign development aid for 90 days, EO 14169, is classic America First. It's designed to audit where U.S. dollars are going and ensure they align with Trump's domestic and strategic priorities. Humanitarian exceptions are built in, but the message is clear. Aid must serve American interests or be restructured. He's also resumed his earlier approach to international institutions, pulling out of the WHO, World Health Organization, and the Paris Agreement again. The argument is about sovereignty and what his administration sees as unfair burdens placed on the U.S., especially compared to China and developing nations. Trade-wise, Trump has reignited tariff battles with China, and even reimposed levies on Mexico and Canada. The logic is the same as before. Punish what he calls unfair trade practices, boost U.S. manufacturing, and negotiate better bilateral terms. Critics warn it risks global economic instability, but supporters say it's about finally standing up to economic freeloading. Finally, Trump is once again leaning hard on Arab-Israeli normalization. He's urging Saudi Arabia to join the Abraham Accords, even as the Gaza conflict makes that harder. His team argues that bringing the Saudis in could realign the region and marginalize Iran, though Riyadh remains cautious without progress on the Palestinian issue. So far, 2025 has shown that Trump's foreign policy continues to be bold, disruptive, and unapologetically nationalist. Whether it brings long-term stability or greater volatility depends on how other powers respond, and whether Trump's high-stakes diplomacy yields real results or just headlines. Now let's show a side-by-side comparison of President Joe Biden's completed term and President Donald Trump's early second-term agenda, which highlights two sharply contrasting worldviews shaping U.S. foreign and domestic policy. Biden's legacy from 2021 to 2025 is widely seen as a return to multilateralism and institutional stability. On the global stage, his administration prioritized rebuilding trust with allies after the turbulence of the Trump years. His response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine became a centerpiece of his foreign policy legacy. He coordinated a broad alliance to impose sweeping sanctions on Moscow, reinforcing NATO's eastern borders, and delivered consistent military and humanitarian aid to Kiev. Analysts across the political spectrum praised this approach for demonstrating U.S. leadership without unilateral overreach. Domestically, Biden secured major infrastructure investments, passed landmark climate and conservation policies, and made historic judicial appointments, including the confirmation of Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. His administration also focused on pandemic recovery, supply chain resilience, and workforce reinvestment. Still, challenges persisted. Criticism mounted over perceptions of slow or cautious responses to emerging conflicts, concerns about border enforcement, and lingering doubts about Biden's age and long-term capacity. These issues contributed to his decision not to seek re-election in 2024, making him a one-term president by choice rather than electoral defeat. Donald Trump's second term has quickly revived the hallmarks of his first. transactional diplomacy, deregulation, and an unapologetically nationalist foreign policy. One of his most controversial early moves was lifting sanctions on Syria, framed by the administration as a pragmatic effort to reset relations under a new Syrian leadership. At the time, Trump locked in massive economic deals, including a $142 billion arms agreement with Saudi Arabia and a $200 billion investment package with Qatar. Trump has also reinitiated talks with China, achieving a temporary easing of tariffs and new promises from Beijing on restricting fentanyl exports. However, these moves come amid rising scrutiny over ethical questions, including his acceptance of a luxury jet from a Gulf state and his administration's rollback of aid programs via Executive Order 14169. On immigration, Trump has escalated enforcement efforts, leading to a spike in deportations and renewed legal battles over border policies. His withdrawal from the WHO, World Health Organization, and the Paris Agreement reflects his continued skepticism of international institutions, consistent with his belief that national sovereignty should outweigh global cooperation. Biden's approach was grounded in coalition building, cautious but deliberate diplomacy, and long-term institutional resilience. Trump's strategy continues to focus on immediate leverage, economic deals, and repositioning American leadership through bilateral force rather than multilateral consensus. Both presidents have left their mark, Biden with a legacy of stability and restoration, Trump with an aggressive reshaping of U.S. posture, both at home and abroad. As 2025 continues to unfold, the world watches to see how Trump's reassertion of America First reshapes not just American politics, but the balance of global power. In the tense weeks leading up to Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, Annalena Baerbock, just weeks into her role as Germany's foreign minister, quickly became a key figure in shaping Germany's response to rising geopolitical instability. She took a vocal and unapologetically values-based stance in foreign policy, one that emphasized international law, human rights, and the rules-based global order, even when that meant pushing back against powerful states like Russia. At the 2022 Munich Security Conference, Baerbock made it clear that Europe was facing a historic fork in the road. She invoked two major 20th century diplomatic moments to underscore the stakes: the 1975 Helsinki Accords and the 1945 Yalta Conference. The Helsinki Accords were a Cold War-era agreement focused on cooperation, non-intervention, and human rights, an ideal Baerbock saw as vital for preserving peace in Europe. In contrast, she pointed to the Yalta Conference as a symbol of backroom deals that carved up Eastern Europe into Soviet-dominated spheres, leading to decades of authoritarian repression. By contrasting these two legacies, Baerbock framed the crisis not just as a regional security issue, but as a test of whether Europe would uphold principles of sovereignty and cooperation or slide back into realpolitik and power divisions. Her support for Ukraine's independence and territorial integrity wasn't just reactive. It was rooted in her broader worldview that smaller nations must be protected from coercion by larger ones, and that security in Europe is inseparable from human rights and international law. She also rejected calls for Germany to remain neutral in the face of Russian aggression, arguing that neutrality in the face of clear violations of sovereignty was a moral failure. Baerbock's leadership signaled a shift in Germany's foreign policy tradition, away from a more cautious, trade-first diplomacy and toward a more assertive posture rooted in democratic values and strategic clarity. Her early speeches and diplomatic engagements in 2022 laid the groundwork for Germany's stronger stance once the invasion began. Baerbock's early months in office, then, were not just about reacting to crisis. They were about redefining Germany's voice in the world, especially in a Europe suddenly forced to reckon with old fears in a new war. Since 2023, Annalena Baerbock has solidified her role as a central figure in shaping Germany's foreign policy, using her platform to emphasize progressive values, strategic diplomacy, and a firm defense of international norms. Baerbock's rollout of Germany's first official feminist foreign policy in March 2023 marked a significant milestone. It wasn't just about gender parity in diplomatic ranks. It also called for addressing global power imbalances, prioritizing human rights, and ensuring marginalized voices are represented in peacebuilding and development programs. This framework places equity at the heart of foreign policy and positions Germany as a leader in a growing international movement alongside countries like Sweden, Canada, and Mexico. She also framed climate change as not just an environmental issue, but a geopolitical one. At the 2024 Berlin Climate and Security Conference, Baerbock made clear that Germany sees climate adaptation and decarbonization as essential to global peace and security. Her speeches drew direct connections between climate stress and conflict zones, especially in regions like the Sahel and the Indo-Pacific, arguing for integrated policy responses that combine foreign aid, defense strategy, and environmental sustainability. In her 2024 trip to Beijing, Baerbock directly confronted China's tacit support of Russia's war effort in Ukraine. She didn't shy away from calling out the contradictions between China's stated neutrality and its growing economic and political ties to Moscow. Her message was clear. Continued Chinese alignment with Russia would hurt relations with Germany and the EU. This stance reflects her broader strategy of strategic realism, pursuing engagement with China on trade and climate while drawing red lines on security and human rights. Baerbock took a bold step in 2024 by ordering the closure of all Iranian consulates in Germany following the execution of German-Iranian dissident Jamshid Sharmad. The move underscored her government's zero-tolerance approach to human rights violations, even when it comes at the cost of diplomatic channels. It was a calculated risk, signaling to Tehran and the international community that Berlin won't compromise its values, especially when its own citizens are involved. Throughout this period, Baerbock has remained one of Europe's most consistent voices in defense of Ukraine. From providing aid packages to visiting Kiev and advocating for tougher EU sanctions against Russia, she played a key role in rallying European unity. Her rhetoric consistently links the war to the broader stakes for international law and democratic security, framing the conflict as a litmus test for the post-Cold War order. Together, these actions show Baerbock's foreign policy isn't just reactive, it's agenda setting. She has turned Germany's role from one of cautious balancing to one that is values forward, strategic, and increasingly vocal on the global stage. Whether it's gender equity, climate security, or geopolitical integrity, Baerbock's approach blends principled diplomacy with strategic assertiveness. As of May 2025, Ursula von der Leyen, a German politician serving as president of the European Commission since 2019, served in the German federal government between 2005 and 2019, holding positions in Angela Merkel's cabinet, most recently as Federal Minister for Defense, is a member of the center-right Christian Democratic Union, CDU, and its affiliated European political party, the European People's Party, EPP, which remains one of the strongest voices in Europe advocating for Ukraine's full integration into Western institutions, both politically and strategically. Contrary to claims that she discouraged NATO discussions, there is no verified public statement from her suggesting that Ukraine's NATO aspirations should be shelved or deterred to avoid provoking Russia. Instead, von der Leyen has emphasized alignment, reform, and readiness, encouraging Ukraine to continue along the path of European integration. In March 2025, she made headlines by suggesting that Ukraine could realistically join the European Union before 2030, if it sustains its progress on reforms. That's a bold commitment considering how long ascension processes typically take, and it signals deep political will at the top of the EU. On the defense side, while von der Leyen has been cautious about specifics around NATO expansion, her broader messaging has focused on fortifying Europe's ability to act. Her Rearm Europe initiative, which calls up for 800 billion euros in coordinated defense spending, reflects her view that Europe should not only support Ukraine materially, but also prepare itself structurally for long-term geopolitical competition and security challenges. This initiative is as much about deterring Russian aggression as it is about reducing dependency on the US. She has also been sharply critical of Vladimir Putin. Her rhetoric frames Russia's war in Ukraine not just as a breach of international law, but as part of a broader campaign to reverse the liberal democratic order that took root after the Cold War. She warned against, quote, being pushed around by history, end quote, reinforcing the idea that European values and security cannot be compromised or dictated by authoritarian pressure. Von der Leyen's foreign policy stance is clear. Ukraine belongs in the European family, and Europe must be ready politically, economically, and militarily to defend that choice. Her recent actions reflect both a strategic realism and a moral clarity that aim to reshape Europe's posture in a more competitive, dangerous world. In part 3 of this series, we'll zoom in on the flashpoints where power politics is playing out most visible today. We'll explore the war in Ukraine, not just as a regional conflict, but as a case study in 21st century hard power, alliance dynamics, and the revival of spheres of influence. We'll turn to the South China Sea, where naval presence, economic coercion, and legal ambiguity collide in a high-stakes struggle for maritime dominance. And we'll examine the evolving power plays in the Middle East, from Israel's regional strategy to Iran and Saudi Arabia's rivalry, and how great powers like the US, Russia, and China compete for influence in a region that refuses to remain on the geopolitical sidelines. As we continue this series, it becomes even more clear. The logic of power politics isn't fading, it's being rewritten in real time.